Welcome to Chapter 12 on the uh, Biblical Hebrew language. Today we're going to go into the introduction to Hebrew verbs. At this point in your study of Hebrew, you have hopefully mastered the essential elements of the Hebrew nouns and pronouns and nominals. It's now time to study the Hebrew verbal system. And the verbs of these words are used to describe an action, like he studied, or a state of being, she is wise. And in the Hebrew Bible, there are just over 23,000 verses. In the midst of these verses are found almost 72,000 verbs. This means that on average, there is approximately 3 verbs on each verse. These statistics demonstrate that you must understand the Hebrew verbal system in terms of form, what they look like, the function of the verb, and meaning to succeed in the language. So in this chapter, you'll learn about the basic grammatical issues relating to the verbs. However, this is just an overview. There's no need to memorize the Hebrew verbal forms in this chapter. We're just going to do an overview of Hebrew verbs, and we're going to give examples. And then in the next lessons, we'll go more in depth into the Hebrew verbs and their stems. Secondly, we need to understand the roots and stems. You're about to discover that many of the nouns you have memorized as vocabulary have verbal counterparts. Now, the following nouns, for example, are listed with their verbal counterparts here. We have Melech. We understand Melech is king. And we look at its verbal counterpart of Malach, to reign. You can see the roots here of the Mem, the Lamed, and the Kaf Sofit here are both in the noun and in the verb. We have Devar, which is word, and we have Deber, which means to speak, the same verbal root. We have Mishpat for judgment, and we have Shaphat to judge, the root in which Mishpat came from. So that's great because now you notice each pair shares a common set of consonants and related definitions. And for this reason, this relationship is due to the fact that they share a common root. The Mem, the Lam, and the Kaf Sofit, or the Dalet, the Bet, or the Resh, or the Shin, the Pei, and the Tav here in Mishpat, they have a common root that they share. So it's very important, basically, to understand the distinction between the root and those words derived from that root. It is a distinction between root and stem. Now, Hebrew roots are typically composed of 3 consonants, which we call triconsonantal, or occasionally with biconsonantal too. A root represents the origin or simplest form in which the number of Hebrew words are derived. Now, from a root, therefore, any number of nouns or verbs may be derived. A stem is the most basic form of any word derived from a root. For example, from the triconsonantal root or the 3-consonant root, we have the Mem, the Lamed, and the Kaf Sofit, come the noun stems Melech. So Melech is a stem or a noun stem which stems from the root Mem, Lamed, Kaf Sofit. We get Malka for queen, Malkut for kingdom, and the verbal stem Malak, to reign or to be king. Once again, notice how each different word shares a common set of consonants and related definitions. This relationship is based upon the sharing of the common root. The system of deriving different words or stems from a common root should be a point of encouragement for the students, since it takes some of the pain out of vocabulary memorization. And that's nice to know. I mean, you can go back to the root and get a basic understanding of what the noun would be from that root right there. Also, we need to understand that within the verb, in English, a verb by itself does not have a person, gender, and number. It must be supplied by the addition of a personal pronoun like she studied. She is the personal pronoun. Studied is the verb. But how in Hebrew, however, most verbs have person, gender, and number. These verbal characteristics are indicated in Hebrew verbs by certain patterns of inflection. So, for example, the word katav means he wrote, and the verb ketava means she wrote. The different endings indicate person, gender, and number. So by looking at katav, I can tell you that this is a third masculine singular verb. The different endings, again, in Hebrew, there's a verbs person, gender, number are usually indicated in the verbal form itself. So these endings will be discussed in the following chapters. Even though most Hebrew verbs are capable of indicating person, gender, and number by themselves, they may also occur with an independent personal pronoun. So there may be a pronoun that's put with the verb, although it's not necessary. For example, both katabti and ani katabti are translated as I wrote. Because most Hebrew verbs by themselves can indicate person, gender, number, the addition of an independent personal pronoun is not usually required. And a lot of times, when it is put there, it's usually, as we're getting later on, shows the emphasis of the person. With regard to person, however, Hebrew verbs can be first person. First person is I and we. I is singular, first person singular. We is first person plural. There's second person, you. Or third person, he, she, it, or they. He, she, or it is singular. They is plural. Now, with regard to the number, Hebrew verbs will be either singular, like I, you, he, she, it, or plural, we, you all, or you, plural, and they. With regard to the Hebrew verbs will be either masculine, which is he, feminine, which is she, or common, meaning either masculine or feminine, I or we. Okay, let's go ahead and get into this chart here. It just gives you a little breakdown, summary of the person. Again, when we go through here, we're going to learn to parse verbs. We're going to learn how to give the basically the stem, the conjugation, and the person, the gender, and the number of that verb. That's how we'll parse that verb. We'll get into that a little bit later on. So we can see that the first person, when we say first person, singular, we're talking about I. When we say first person plural, we're talking about we. Second person, singular, is you. Second person plural is you all. So, we're getting to the person I, we, you. Third person is he, she, it, or they. When we get into the gender, we say masculine, referring to masculine objects, and feminine, referring to feminine objects or subjects, and common, referring to masculine or feminine subjects. When we're talking about number, we say first person, masculine, and we give the number. Singular, referring to one person or thing, or plural, referring to more than one person or thing. Okay, so what we're going to do here, let's go ahead and get into the verbal stems. Now, in the Hebrew verbal system, there are 7 major stems. There is the cow stem here, the nifal stem, the pl stem, the pual stem, the hifil stem, the hofal stem, and the hitpael stem. The cow stem is the basic or simple verbal stem. From the cow stem, all other verbal stems are formed. For this reason, the nifal through the hitpael stems are called derived stems. That's important. because their forms are derived or based on the cow stem. Verbal stems tell us two things about the action or the meaning of a verb. First, it tells us the type of verbal action, and secondly, the voice of verbal action, whether it's active voice, middle voice, passive voice. So it tells us the type of action and the voice of the verbal action. In Hebrew, there are three basic categories of verbal action. There's simple action, to break. There's intensive action, to smash into pieces. And then there's the causative action, to cause to break. There are also three basic categories of verbal voice. There's the active, the passive, and the reflexive. The voice of a verb indicates the relationship between the subject of a verb and the action of the verb. Stated differently, voice indicates whether the subject acts or is acted upon. With the active voice, the subject of the verb is performing the action of the verb. In example, David defeated the enemy. David is the subject, defeated, and the subject of the verb, defeated, and he is performing the action. Now, with the passive voice, the subject of the verb is receiving the action of the verb. So, the subject is actually receiving that action. For example, David was defeated by the enemy. David is no longer performing the action of the verb, but it's receiving the verbal action. And so, with the reflexive voice, the subject of the verb is both doing and receiving the action of the verb. So in the example, David dressed himself, David is both performing and receiving the verbal action. David dressed, and then he dressed himself. So notice that the sentence was rendered reflexive by using the English reflexive pronoun himself. And that's how we would translate the reflexive voice of the Hebrew verb with a reflexive pronoun. Alright, we're going to go into 12.6 now. English and Hebrew spellings of the verbal stems with their diagnostics. Now, the names of the Hebrew verbal stems might seem strange at first. They sound strange just because they are traditional Hebrew names. For example, the cow stem, here, and they have it written here in the Hebrew, kal, or kal, is the basic verbal stem. Now, the term cow means simple, with reference to the fact that the root is unaugmented. Nothing has been added to it. The 6 derived stems have names that are constructed on the verbal root pa'al, the pei, the ayin, and the lamed, indicating each in its perfect third masculine singular form. Okay, you should carefully study how the names are constructed because their spelling preserves certain diagnostic points of vocalization. That is very important because if you understand pa'al, which pa'al means to do, and so if you take the root here, the pei, the ayin, and the lamed, when you go into these different derived stems, you'll see the augmentations and the vocalizations that are added to this root to show you what to look for. Note that in the following chart, you'll see the references to what is called a stem vowel. In Hebrew, the stem vowel is that vowel which is associated with the second consonant of the verbal root. Here we go here. Okay, we have the cow stem, or kal, which is unaugmented. This is the simple stem here. We have the nifal stem, and you can see that the nifal, you have the root pei, ayin, lamed. You have added a nun to it. Nun is the prefix, so that's in the perfect tense. Again, we're looking at the perfect third masculine singular. You have the nun. That is a diagnostic indicator here, and the patak as a stem vowel. In the PL stem, we have the root of pe, ayin, lamed, but the difference is you have the heric under the first consonant and the sere under the stem vowel. So that is those are the diagnostic indicators here of the PL perfect stem vowel. Is the heric and the sere here. We have the pual. Again, we have the root here, but we have the kibbutz and the patak vowel pattern here. Tells us that this is a pual stem, third masculine singular. We have the hifil stem. You have the hey with as a prefix with a heric, and then you have the stem vowel, a heric yod. That tells you that is a hifil perfect third masculine singular. And this is the hifil stem. You have the hafal or the hafal in here, which has a hey here. And now this is not a chametz, this is chametz hatuf here. Then you have the non-vocal shava, because this is closing the syllable, haf, al. And then you have the patak as the stem vowel. Alright, these are all imperfects, third masculine singulars. We have the hitpayel stem, and you can see that the hey with the heric with the tav with the shava under is the prefix to the root. And then you have the sere as the stem vowel. So just in the name itself, hit pa el tells you the how the diagnostics of it on here. Hit pa el in here. So just by knowing the stems and what names of the different stems gives you the understanding of the diagnostic indicators and the stem vowels and the vocalization of that perfect third masculine singular. Alright, let's get into the Hebrew verbal root system. In this section, we're going to briefly discuss the significance of the cow and derived stems in terms of their verbal action and voice. Please note that what follows is a simple preview of basic information. So we're just going to look at these basic, simple little things here about different stems. We got the cow stem here. The cow stem is a simple or basic verbal stem. Cow verbs are active in voice, though that there are a few passive forms do exist. The cow stem exhibits the simple, unnuanced type of action. An example of this would be in the cow stem of Shema, meaning to hear, or he heard. Just very simple. He heard in here. The nifal stem is used to express simple action with either a passive or reflexive voice. In other words, whatever verb means in the cow stem, it becomes passive or reflexive in the nifal stem. An example of a verb in the nifal stem is, again, we're going to use Shema, is nishma, meaning he was heard, which is basically passive. The subject receives the action. Or he heard himself, which is reflexive use. Notice the change in spelling of Shema, cow, to nifal. You add the addition of the nun with the heric, with the non-vocal shava, then the stem vowel with the patak. The most notable difference between the two forms is the prefixing of the nun with the heric to the nifal stem. Nifal will remind you that every verb in the nifal stem takes a nun prefix. This prefix is unique to the nifal stem, and so it distinguishes it from the other stems, verbal stems here. So when you see that, I mean, we'll get into, when we get into the verbs, you'll be able to see um, that there's some similarities in there when you get into the verbal stems here. Third, we have the PL stem, which is sometimes used to express an intensive action, type of action with an active voice. In other words, the simple action of the cow stem will take on some type of intensive nuance in the PL stem. For example, shabar or shavar means he broke in the cow stem. When we put it in the PL form, shiber, it means he smashed into pieces. So we'll notice that the change in the spelling from shavar to shiber here. The distinguishing characteristics of the PL stem are unique vowel pattern and the presence of the doggish forte in the second root. You got the doggish in the second root of the bet, and the hic under the shin, and the sere under as the stem vowel. Shiber. Those are the characteristics of the PL stem here in the perfect tense. When we get down to the pual is the passive form of the PL. So PL is intensive. So the pual stem therefore is used to express an intensive type of action with a passive voice. For example, the PL verb shiber means he smashed into pieces. The pual form, however, would be shubar and is translated as he or it was smashed into pieces. So it uses the passive form of the PL. It received, the subject received the action, the intensive action of the verb. Notice how a form of the English verb to be, like was used to make the translation passive. So like the PL, the pual is distinguished by the presence of a doggish forte in the bait right here. And it has the kibbutz vowel under the first root consonant and a patak under as a stem vowel under the bet. Now this vowel pattern will distinguish the pual stem from the corresponding PL stem. Remember, PL had the hic, doggish forte in the middle root, and the sere stem vowel. Pual has the kibbutz under the first consonant, doggish forte in the middle consonant, and a patak. And so you know, as you go through it and you go through the lessons, you'll become very familiar with it. Number 5, the hifil stem is used to express causative action with an active voice. For example, the verb malak means he was king or he reigned in the cow stem. The hifil form, however, is himlik, and it means he caused to reign or he made someone king. So we'll notice that the change in the spelling from malak in the cow stem to himlik in the hifil. We have the addition of the prefix of the hey, the hic, the mem, and the non-vocal shava, and then the stem vowel of the hic yod. And so that's basically that makes the difference. Is the main thing is you're looking for the root. You want to look for any augmentations or any prefixes and what their stem vowels are, and the vowel patterns. And that's going to set apart everything from one stem to the other stem here. So now let's get into the hofal here, the sixth stem, or the hafal. The hafal is the passive form of the hifil. The hofal stem therefore is used to express causative action with a passive voice. For example, the hifil verb himlik means he made someone king or he caused someone to become king. The hafal hamlak and is translated he was made king. It's the passive use of the causative. He was caused to be made king. Notice how the hay is prefixed to both the hifil and hafal, or hofal, clearly distinguishing them from the previous stems. The hifil and the hofal are distinguished from one another by their prefix and stem vowels. That's very important. You see, they both have the hay, but the hifil has the hirik, hifil has the hirik, and the hafal or hofal has the chametz hatuf. Okay, and then the stem vowel is the hirik yod in the hifil and patak in the hafal. And that's how you're going to determine that which stem it is in. Now let's get to the seventh stem here, the hitpael. Again, we can see by the word hitpael what it's going to bring in, what diagnostics is going to be indicated here. The hitpael stem is used to express an intensive type of action with a reflexive or sometimes passive voice. For example, the verb chavara means he hid in the cow stem. The hitpael form is chitchave. It means he hid himself. It's being used reflexive. Notice the drastic change in spelling from chava, which is cow stem, has a comments, to hitchave. You got the prefix of the hay, the hirik, and the tav with the non-vocal shava, and then you have the patak sere vowel pattern. The most notable difference between these two forms is the prefixing of the hit here, the hay hirik with a tav to the first consonantal root, and the dagesh forte in the second root. See, you got the dagesh forte in the bait here. So we've had the dagesh forte in the PL, the pual, and now the hitpael. So, like I said here, at this point, it's helpful to note that all verbs exhibiting an intensive type of action, like the PL, the pual, and the hitpael, insert a dagesh forte into the second consonant verbal root. Now, this is a diagnostic feature of the intensive stems. That's very important to note. The term diagnostic means that the presence of a dagesh forte in the second root consonant is a feature that identifies or diagnoses the intensive verbal stems. So when we examine a Hebrew verb and see this diagnostic feature, we will be able to successfully identify or diagnose the verbal stem being used here. And we're going to give a little chart here of the stems here. Basically what we have here is, first we have the cow stem, which is basically the simple action. It has simple action here and active voice, and the active voice. Then the next one is the nifal, which is actually a cow stem. It's simple, but it has a passive voice or a reflexive voice. Now when we get into the intensive stems, which is the PL intensive has a active voice. He smashed the pot. The pual is the passive intensive voice. It was smashed. And then we have the hitpael, which is the reflexive voice of the intensive. It smashed itself in here. So you can see the three different categories of the type of action: simple action, intensive action, and then the causative action brings in the hifil. The hifil voice is the active causative, and the hofal or hafal is the passive voice of causative action. Again, we're just going to do an overview. We're going to go into more of this when we get in, because there's a lot of information here, and you're not really having to learn it now. We're just going to do an overview here. So what we want to do is give you an idea of what it looks like here. We have the cow verbal stem, Again, we want to, when we parse a verb, we're going to say what stem it is first, and then what tense or what conjugation it is, and then we're going to give the person, the gender, and the number. And we'll get into the causative, the conjugation, a little bit later on. Here we have the cow stem, which is Shema. He heard. The nifal of Shema is Nishma. He was heard. The PL form of Shabar, to break, is Shiber. He smashed into pieces. The Pual of Shabar is Shubar. A Shabar is Shubar, and it was smashed into pieces. Again, it's the passive use. The Pual is the passive of PL, as the Nifal is the passive of cow. Then we have Hifil here. He made king. And the Hofal, he was made king. The passive of the causative of Hifil. Then we have Hippael, which is the reflexive. He hid himself. So it's important to note that most of the Hebrew verbs are not testing each of the basic verbal stems. Basically, there's a lot of Hebrew verbs that are not found or found in the scriptures in every one of these 7 stems. For example, the Hebrew verb meaning to love, ahav, and it does not occur in the Hofal stem. Similarly, the PL verb, deber, does not occur in the Hifil or the Hofal stems. So there are certain Hebrew verbs that are not attested to all 7 stems. Alright, and what we're going to do is go ahead and get into the verbal stems and the verbal meanings. The meaning of a verb in the cow may be different when the same verb appears in another stem. And this is one of the major reasons why it's important to understand the verbal stems as presented above. For example, the Hebrew verb shavar in the cow means to break. The same verb in the PL stem, shaber, means to smash into pieces. In this and many other instances, the relationship between the 2 meanings is apparent in the light of the discussion above. So it's very important that we understand the verbal root and then the stems from that root, because when you go into from one stem to another, it's different. The meaning changes. Other instances, however, the reason for the change in the verbal meaning between the different stems may not be apparent. And for example, the verb barak means to kneel in the cow. The same verb root in the PL stem means to bless. So what we need to do is consult the lexicon to be certain what the verb's meaning is given in that particular stem. Okay, I guess what we'll do here too is we're going to go into the introduction to the verbal conjugations here. And in English, verbs are conjugated in order to express different verbal functions. The term conjugation is used to describe the inflected verbal forms that express particular verbal functions. So when we're talking about tense, we're talking about conjugations. So that's the important word, conjugations, verbal conjugations. And so we're going to get into the different verbal conjugations that we have here in a verb or a verbal form. English verb may be, well, the English verb may be conjugated in the present tense in order to express action taking place but not yet completed. And that is an incomplete or imperfective action here. For example, we have in the singular, I study, you study, he, she, it studies. In the plural, we have we study, you all study, and they study. The same verb may also be conjugated in the past tense in order to express action that has been completed, that is a perfect action. So if we wanted to say it in the past tense, I studied, in English we add the ed onto it. I studied, you studied, he, she, it studied. Plural is we studied, you all studied, they studied. Now, this verb may also be conjugated in a future tense in order to express action not yet begun but expected in the future. For example, in English we would say, I will study, you will study, he, she, it will study. And then if we don't want to say the plural, then we will study, you will, all will study, and they will study. So the English verbs may also be conjugated as participles. And usually in English, anything that's got an ing is a participle. Running, studying, looking, caring, those are called participles in English. We have also infinitives called to study. Whenever you have to use the word to in front of the verb, it's called an infinitive. We have imperatives, which are commands to study. Each English verb takes on a different form. Study, studies, studied, studying, and to study, in order to express a different verbal function here. And that's important to know. That's what you call the conjugations. And in the Hebrew, there are 8 basic verbal conjugations. There's the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, the cohortative, the jussive, the infinitive, construct, and then the infinitive absolute, and then the participle. This means that a verb in the cow may be conjugated in any one of 8 different ways, depending on what verbal function the author intends. So in most of the cases, the change in the verbal function will be identifiable by a change in the verbal form. So each of the derived stems, nifal all the way through hipael, may also be conjugated in any one of these 8 different conjugations. So in the Hebrew, therefore, there are 7 verbal stems, cow through the hipaels, and there's 8 verbal conjugations, perfect through the participle. So, for example, the cow verb shema may be conjugated any one of 8 different ways depending on the intended function of the verb. It could be a cow participle, it could be a cow infinitive, it could be a cow imperative, etc. The same verb in the nifal stem may also be conjugated in the 8 different Hebrew conjugations: a nifal participle, a nifal infinitive, nifal imperative. So, you have all these different possibilities that are being used, but at this point, we're going to go through each one as we go through it. And that's the reason why we're going to spend a lot of time on the verbs. We're first going to go into the cow stem, and then we're going to go into each derived stem and go through all its conjugations and usages. Again, the perfect tense conjugation is used to express a completed action or a state of being. So basically, it's that type of action. The action has been completed in the mind of the author. Now, the perfect aspect denotes completed action, whether it's in the past, present, or future. That's one thing you want to know. It's what we call the aspect of a verb, is the type of action. It's not necessarily the tense that we're as much interested in. It's actually more of the type of action. Completed action, incompleted action. Here. Now, the imperfect verb denotes incompleted action. The imperfect denotes incompleted action, whether it's in the past, present, or future. And we would render in English translation different usages here. For example, the imperfect, we would say, I will study. And it could be imperfect present. It could in English say I study or I will study. It's showing incomplete action, whether it's in present or future. Now, the action of the verb occurs either at the time of speaking or after the time of speaking. And the Hebrew imperfect also can be used to denote habitual or customary action. For example, he prays regularly, or he used to pray. Those are habitual uses of the imperfect. We could use also several modal values, which would, could, should, may, might, can. These are kind of wishes, or used for wishes or desires. So, once we get into that, we'll learn how to recognize the best possible translation based upon the context of the scriptures here, or of the text itself. It also needs to be emphasized that, like the perfect, the imperfect does not have tense, which is time of action, apart from the context and issues of the syntax. So the tense of the verb is based upon the context and the issues of the sentence structure, and that its primary signifies the type of action, like I mentioned earlier, whether it's complete action or incomplete action. The imperfect denotes incomplete action, whether it's in the past, present, or future. Now, the other aspect, as we're going through these conjugations, we've gone through perfect, which denotes completed action. We've gone through imperfect, which denotes incomplete action. Now we get into imperative. In imperative, there's the next three conjugations: imperative, cohortative, and jussive, are volitional conjugations, meaning they are used to express some type of command, some type of wish, or some type of desire. The imperative conjugation is used primarily to express direct commands, and that's usually in the second person. We find out you. It's understood. You singular or you plural is a command, and demanding immediate action from the one being addressed. It also can be used to request a permission or communicate a request or desire. The Hebrew imperative occurs only in the second person. For example, you defend the cause of the weak. And so imperatives are found only in the second person. Here, okay. Next, we have the cohortative. The second volitional conjugation is used much like the imperative to express a wish, request, or command. It may also be used, however, to express purpose in order to, or we would translate resulting in. So this is used in the first person here. The cohortative, let me, let us, um, let me honor the Lord, let us honor the Lord. So it's used in the first person, either singular or plural, and that is what we call a cohortative. Now, jussive is used in the third person. The jussive conjugation is also used to express either some type of mild command or strong wish. So strictly speaking, it occurs only in third person, singular and plural. Like, may the Lord give to me another son. That is a what's called jussive. Uh, also, also let there be light. In Bereshit, that was very. You have the justice a lot in there, right there. So the cohortative occurs in also. Uh, let's see. The commands, the imperative brings forth commands in the second person. The cohortives occur in the first person, and the justices occur in the third person. So we want to go through each one of those and be familiar with those. Those are commands, wishes, or desires. We also have the infinitive construct, which is number 6. And infinitive is a verbal noun. So in Hebrew, there are two infinitive forms. There's the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute. The infinitive construct may function much like an English infinitive, like to study or to work, usually translated with the preposition to plus a verb. Like a noun, it can be used as the subject, like to study is hard work, or as an object of a verb, I want to study. So we'll get into this when we get into in more detail when we get into chapter 20 here. But they're just going through basics, the 8 different conjugations. Number 7 conjugation, as we mentioned before, is the infinitive absolute. The infinitive absolute has no real English counterpart. It may be used in conjunction with other verbs. to emphasize or intensify the verbal action. And we've seen it quite a bit. It's just in the English here, and when we read the scriptures. Um, so, as we get into it, it may be used in conjunction with other verbs to emphasize or intensify the verbal action, and it may also be used in the place of an imperative to express a command. Um, and also, in special instances, it can be used with other verbs to express two verbal actions occurring at the same time. That's happening at the same time, basically, contemporaneous, they say, action. But we'll get more into this. Again, this is just an overview here. Um, we have number 8 is the participle. And in the English, participle is anything we have with ing on there. Studying, learning, smashing, running, talking. That is a participle. And so it's both verbal and adjective characteristics. Verbally expresses some type of verbal action, as such as studying or learning, and as an adjective, it's used much like a Hebrew adjective in an attributive or predicative or substantive use here. So it can be used either way here, and we'll get more in depth when we get into that chapter here, dealing with the participles in each. Now, we also have what they call strong and weak verbs. Hebrew verbs are classified as either strong or weak, and the strong verbs have no weak consonants. Weak verbs, however, have at least one weak root. Now, the weak principal consonants are the gutturals and resh. For example, the verbs katal, katav, or kafatz are strong verbs because they don't have any gutturals in here. But shema, matzah, and Allah, they are weak verbs because they have a guttural in here, one or more gutturals. Now, the consonants yod and nun are also considered weak, but only when they appear as the first consonant of the verbal root. So whenever you have a first nun verb or first yod, those are considered weak also, like yashav or nafal, and only in certain conjugations. So the biconsonantal, which means there's two roots, there's two consonants, or the geminate verbal roots are also considered to be weak. Remember the geminate noun we had before, where the last two consonants of the root were the same. That's what a geminate verbal root is. Biconsonant roots have two rather than three root consonants, as in kam, he arose, and geminate roots are those in which the second and third root consonants are identical. Now, we've had that in the nouns, as we said earlier. He surrounded. Now, when studying the various Hebrew conjugations, you will first learn the strong verbs, and then we're going to go into the weak verb forms afterwards. So we'll learn the strong form, and then we'll go into the weak verbs in their system of classification here. Well, and the classifications are either as which root letter is weak. If it's the first, it indicates that that's the first guttural is in the first position, the first consonant. If it's second, then it's the second consonant. If it's third, it's the third consonant. That's a guttural. And sometimes they can have more than one. They can have multiple in here. So we'll get into the first guttural here. We'll get a little chart here. It gives us a classification of the weak verbal roots here. Our first guttural would be amad. The ayin here is a guttural, and that's in the first position here. A second guttural is ga'al. The aleph is the second root letter here. A third guttural, which is either a chet or an ayin, is barak. It has a third guttural here of the chet right here. Third aleph example is matzah. You have a third aleph. The aleph is in the third root position. And then we have what we call a third hay verb, which is the hay is in the third root position here. We have first yod, yashav, as I mentioned earlier, a first noon, which the noon's in the first root position, And then we have what they call doubly weak verbs, where they have two um, gutturals in here. You have a first guttural, which is the ayin, and then you have a third hey and Allah to go up. We have biconsonantal roots, which are com, only two root consonants. You have a kof and a mem suffix here. We have geminates, which are the identical second and third consonants here. So you have a samic, then you have a bait. Those are called geminates, and we have a lot of geminates um, in the Hebrew. Now let's get into the word order in Hebrew verbal sentences. In English, the ordering of words in a sentence helps identify the function of those words. For example, the sentence, Jacob loved Rachel. Jacob is the subject of the verb because his name precedes the verb. Jacob loved. Additionally, Rachel is also the object of the verb because her name follows the verb. Now, if the sentence was Rachel loved Jacob, then Rachel would be the subject and Jacob would be the object because of their positions in the sentence. So in English, normal word order is subject, verb, object. In Hebrew, however, the normal word order for a sentence is verb, subject, and then object. And we'll get some examples here. In Genesis 1:1, we got bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Okay, first we have the verb bara, then we have the subject, then we have the direct object of both shemayim and haaretz here. And so we see that there are frequent variations and exceptions to this normal order in words in Hebrew sense. For example, it's not uncommon for the direct object to stand at the beginning of a Hebrew sentence for the purpose of emphasis. This is very important. As the following example, it's a way that the writer brings emphasis to the structure here. Et Adonai Elohecha Terah. The Lord, your God, you shall fear. So the emphasis is placed on the direct object here, that only the Lord, your God, you are to fear. And that's the reason why it's placed at the beginning of the sentence here. In this example, observe how the direct object, et Adonai Elohecha, precedes the verb terah for the purpose of emphasis. And we're going to get into the discussion of issues related in chapter 23. So let's go ahead and get into parsing of Hebrew verbs. In the following chapters, you'll learn how to parse Hebrew verbs. Parsing is a process where you'll be able to identify the verb stem, like cow stem or nifal, its conjugation, whether it's perfect or imperfect or imperative, the person, the gender, and the number, and the lexical form in which we found it in. For example, the verb nishma is parsed as a nifal, perfect, third masculine singular verb from shema. And so you can get a lot of practice at this in your homework when you get these different chapters here. So you'll be able to identify, again, the key thing is we want to identify the root by taking off the clothing off that verb right there. Tell what stem it is. Tell what conjugation it is. And then the person, the gender, the number, and then the lexical form in which it is found in. Okay, and that leads us over here to the lexical form for Hebrew verbs. The lexical form of a triconsonantal, which is a three-consonant verb, is the cow perfect, third masculine singular. And so that is where you would find the lexical form in. This is also the form of the verb that you will be memorizing for vocabulary. Now with the biconsonantal verbs, however, you'll memorize a different lexical form, which we'll get into later on. Which is mainly found in the infinitive conjugations. But we'll get into that when we get into that. Okay, that's just been a brief overview. Again, there's no sense in memorizing this now. We're going to go into each lesson, and we're just going into the area for the pretty much the rest of the course into verbs and uh, and their usage and their nuances that they have here. So until the next lesson, go ahead and do your homework in this chapter, and we will come back with the homework later on.